It's really humbling to be here with you today, especially to talk about governance in the public sector when there is so much chaos currently in my home country. It feels almost embarrassing to be here talking as if there's something that the UK can teach you, but bear with me. I'm really excited to be here, really excited to share, and I think especially to learn. I've heard from colleagues about some of the great work that's going on across your organisations and systems, so would love to, in future instances, hear directly from you and spend some time learning about what we can take back to Camden. I'll say a little bit about Camden as a place, not too much, because I want to kind of concentrate on its story really, but I think a little bit of context is helpful. So Camden is part of London government. So it's a borough within north central London. It has about 250,000 people. It's got a series of neighbourhoods that you might kind of recognise. They're quite iconic places like Camden Town, King's Cross, Covent Garden, but also a sort of outer ring of neighbourhoods like Kilburn and Kentish Town, which are kind of places, neighbourhoods in themselves, that are part of the sort of outer London economy. So they're quite different, and it's quite a place of real contrasts. So we have extreme wealth and really significant pockets of poverty. So in King's Cross, where I'm based, we've got organisations like Google, the British Museum, the Francis Crick Institute, all of which are a stone's throw from some of the poorest places in the UK. So we have the third highest number of businesses in any local authority in the UK, but 40% of Camden children live in relative poverty. It's interesting always talking to colleagues who work at a local level in different countries. I'll talk a little bit about the UK context, but also why I think it's useful partly to kind of park that. Because everyone, I think, has a story of how they're kind of constrained by the relationship between the local and the national. UK government is, as we would describe it, quite centralised. So local government has no constitutional basis. It's what we call a creature of central government. So it can be swept away by legislation. There's no kind of guarantee of it. And then if you look at things like where tax is collected in the UK, amongst G7 countries, it's the lowest level of collection of tax at a local level. So less than half of Germany, significantly lower than France, significantly lower than Italy. But as I say, I think that can be a distraction when I talk to colleagues from French government, German government, wherever really. Everyone has a story of how the centre can be kind of dominating. What I strongly believe and why I work for a local government is that I think the power and dynamism and creativity of places can get past a lot of that. And that's the thing that we should kind of concentrate on. What I'm going to talk about today is 4 things really. And I might take a pause halfway through, but I'll see how I'm feeling. I want to give you plenty of time for kind of reflections and questions, but these are kind of the broad themes that I'm going to cover. The first is around purpose-led leadership. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the political and official leadership in Camden and why that's really fundamental to our story. I know there's a lot of interest in the room around mission-orientated approaches, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the process that Camden went through working with Mariana Mazzucato to set our community-led renewal missions and what that means for us as an organisation, where we are with it, some of the good things about it, some of the challenges as well. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call kind of dynamic capability, but really that's about reform of organisations and systems. One of the things that is really important in my role is how we change the council, how we build and upgrade the capacity to be able to respond in an agile way and to respond to crisis. And the last thing I'm going to talk about is, I guess, a little bit of inspiration, really. A theme that you'll see throughout what I talk about is imagination. and municipal imagination. And we're starting to do some quite experimental work with how you might build imaginative capacity in our workforce and in our communities. And I offer that up in the spirit of it being something kind of interesting, hopefully kind of inspirational, very early. So we don't quite know where it's going, but I think exciting nonetheless. So the first, and I think most important of these is leadership. So we live in really complex times. Within my organization, we talk about conditions of permacrisis, multiple and overlapping crises over the last 3 or 4 years that Camden has experienced. Sometimes those have been national and international, like COVID-19, or the Afghan refugee crisis, where Camden, because it's a port of entry and because of where it's located, because of its transport links, has seen a huge influx of Afghan refugees and real struggles around how we support and house families. And then local crises, but all of these things overlap and interact and prevent you from settling on what we once would have described as the basics of local government, good administration of an area. I'm going to talk about a particular type of leadership, I suppose. So one which is relational, so about relationships first and foremost between the council and the community, within the council, between colleagues, a leadership that is deeply ambitious, that doesn't accept a kind of limited conception of what local government and regional government should be, but is hugely ambitious for our communities. And then one that emphasizes empathy and deep listening, kind of above all of the things. And we'll talk about 2 leaders, and there's 2 quotes, I think, that illustrate the way that they think and the way that they act. So the first of these is from the leader of the council, so one of my bosses. Georgia is a councillor in Kentish Town. She's the leader of the council. She also has really important roles at a London level, and is kind of a significant figure politically in UK government. She came into her role in 2017, so she's quite an established leader. But what she's introduced, I suppose, at a political level is a new type of language, which thinks about the statecraft of local government in a different way. So this quote, I think, illustrates it really well. It's from a lecture that George gave earlier this year, and at the back of the presentation, which I'll share at some point, there's a link to that lecture, and it's actually a really compelling summary of what I'll talk about today, and far more compelling than I can do justice to. But Georgia has talked about things like imagination, things like love and community power. So certainly in UK local government, and I think this is probably true internationally, the language of how you manage and lead at a local level has often been infused with the sort of vocabulary of new public management. It's been about efficiency, about delivery. So it's quite compelling to hear someone talk about a different set of words, a more kind of human set of words. And then how do you then translate that into the business of an organization? And the second quote from the second leader is another one of my bosses. So this is from Jenny Rowlands, who's the chief executive of Camden. So she leads the officer group, so works really closely with the politicians, but she's responsible for the organization, how it delivers, how it develops. And here Jenny is talking about, so this is a quote actually from a talk that she gave to her leadership group. So directors like me who deliver kind of major services. And what she's saying here is, I guess, a rejection of that new public management mindset, wanting to push back with all our might against it, to replace markets and metrics and management with love, empathy, purpose, and leadership. So I think it's the sort of administrator voice here, which I think is saying an aligned message with Georgia, which is that we can push beyond that sort of framework of new public management, which we have all as public servants to an extent kind of grown up with and are kind of schooled in. And Jenny talks a lot about purpose, and purpose being the thing that kind of guides action, especially in circumstances where things are complex or where they are chaotic, where there are no answers. The ability to plan is very limited, and essentially you have to act and make sense afterwards. So purpose is really important. It provides a kind of guide. And we talk about needing a compass rather than a map. So story and narrative is really important within that. And earlier this year, we published 2 documents, again, which I'll provide kind of links to. The first is called We Make Camden, which is our community vision. You know, it sets out the ambitions that we have as a place. It sets out our values and the things that kind of animate us as a community. And the second document is called The Way We Work, which is more focused on the council itself, staff. So it sets out our kind of values and purpose as a group of public servants. And it's quite different to kind of normal workforce strategies that you often see in UK local government, in that it aims to kind of kick off a conversation with staff. So it's a participative, deliberative approach where essentially we've posed staff a set of questions, inquiry questions around which over the next year to 18 months they will come around in their teams and discuss. And the purpose really is to help them kind of go deeper and really interrogate some of the questions about what does relational practice mean in different teams, different parts of the organization, which do very different things. You know, a hugely diverse organization which does housing, library services, children's social work. So there's always a sort of process of taking a corporate purpose, that the thing that animates us all and brings us together, and trying to understand that what does that mean in the day-to-day? What does it mean at the level of team, really? But my point here is that kind of narrative story is incredibly important. It's really kind of powerful and can be really consequential. Just building on that a little bit, I think one of the things that I think is important around leadership is holding space for complexity. So I think we live in an age of crisis. We live at a point of dissonance where the kind of new public management paradigm still exists, still structures the rules, regulations, and legislation which UK local government is governed by, has to respond to. But at the same time, we're positing a new way of thinking, which is based around community power, based around a more equal relationship with communities, based on some of those values around love, empathy, purpose. So there's a real job of being able to hold people through needing to think about both of those things at the same time, because it's not an option to think about one or the other. And then the political and managerial imagination, a really expansive view of what local government is, which is based on conversation with the community rather than what we are told by central government, what is expected of us. The Camden often talks about itself as a shining city on top of the hill, a place because of its position, because it's relatively well resourced, it's quite prominent in the sector, that can help to shape not just Camden, but also what's going on in London, and also what's going on across the UK, and increasingly in conversations like this, being part of a global community of local and regional governments that think in the same way and have the same ambition for their places. Another thing which feels kind of fundamental is around a framework for acting in different time horizons. So currently in the UK, as I'm sure where you are, we're dealing with a really difficult winter. The energy crisis, inflation, which is particularly challenging in the UK, but I know a challenge everywhere. There's a real squeeze on people's income, and effectively we're in a crisis to kind of manage the cost of living and support our citizens through what will be a really difficult winter. So how do you act to keep people well, warm, supported over the course of the next couple of months, while still concentrating on the deeper structural issues which lead to that situation in the first place? You know, our fiscal settlement, the way our welfare system works, and how do you provide evidence and make a case for that transition? So the job of leadership in Camden is often to support our organisation to do both of those things at the same time. And then lastly, there is something about governing with humility. So I know you've, some colleagues in the room have recently spent some time with Finnish government, which is a real kind of inspiration to places like Camden. And that kind of notion of humility, not jumping to solutions, the embrace of experiment and failure, and the bravery that you need to be able to say, I don't know, or I don't have the answer yet, the robustness that you need to be able to experiment and learn, feels really important to changing and adapting, but also it feels like the role of leaders is to create a safe environment for that to happen, because without that safe environment, it's very difficult for people to take risks. So the role of a political leader, the role of a person who's leading the officer group feels kind of really important to me. I'm going to talk now a little bit about like vehicles, mechanisms. So given what I've said about kind of leadership, complexity, crisis, what are the practical ways in which you can make progress towards shared goals? Camden has had a relationship with the Institute of Innovation and Public Purpose for a number of years. They're based in Camden. Georgia and Mariana have known each other for a period of time. We were beginning to work with them prior to the COVID crisis, but when that hit and we began to think about recovery and renewal, we began to develop a program of work which would help us to recover as a place, but do that in a way which rejected the status quo, was very clear about not wanting to slip back into the situation that we were before, to build back better, and to do that in a particular way, which kind of galvanized our community, brigaded new resources, new thinking around kind of complex problems in a way that can't be achieved simply by a local government on its own. So Georgia and Mariana co-chaired a commission whose job of work it was to develop a series of renewal missions which would become a focus for the borough over the next 10 years. So they led that, but supported by a really diverse group of commissioners from across the borough, some people with kind of national roles and remits, quite an exciting group of people who came together around a participatory process with our community to develop the 4 missions that you see on the right hand side of the page. So they've, as you'll see there, they're not exclusively or simply about innovation or the economy. So they straddle the social and economic divide, I guess. But they respond to a couple of like really urgent problems. One, I suppose, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a massive focus in Camden on the disproportional impact of COVID and of the cost of living crisis on our Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities. So huge programs of work going on. But one of the things that came up in the work of the commission was around who holds power and how they hold power, and how places are governed. And so our diversity mission seeks to reform the way kind of public organisations and private organisations in Camden work, so that the people who make decisions in them, the people who are prominent in them, better to reflect what is an incredibly diverse community in Camden. Young people, so COVID-19 crisis in the UK, one of the kind of clear impacts is on the labour market and how it works or doesn't work for young people. So deep, potentially scarring effects of long-term unemployment and worklessness for young people as they make that transition into the labour market. So a kind of real urgent focus on that. Food. So food poverty and food insecurity is a structural problem in the UK. So how might we come together as a community to think about different ways of our food system operating, different ways of supporting people around income, which enables them to eat sustainably. So again, kind of a real focus on that. And then lastly, around the council's housing stock. So Camden is a major social landlord, but our housing estates aren't in the condition that we would ideally like them to be, nor are they kind of seen as positive, inviting places to live. Those who know them well know that there is huge kind of creativity, imagination, excitement that happens on those estates, but I don't think that is kind of fully recognised or fully supported. So our estates mission tries to reimagine how we think about council housing in Camden. So thinks about them as places of creativity, thinks about them as places which are really relevant to the climate transition, tries to address some of the challenges around health and well-being that are experienced by people who live on our estates. And these four missions meet the IIPP's sort of test, their framework around mission-orientated approaches. So they're bold and inspirational, relevant to our communities. They set a clear direction and they're time-bound, but they're also ambitious and realistic. They're stretching, but they could be done. And I think probably most important for me, that they support a cross-disciplinary, cross-sectoral, cross-organisational approach. The resources, the investment to deliver on that level of ambition doesn't exist. So you need more capability, more kind of attention brigaded around them. It can't just be the local authority who's tasked with it. And then that they're structured to involve a range of different solutions that can kind of bubble up from below as well as being supported from above. And I won't talk about this in huge detail, but one of the things that's been really interesting about working with the IIPP has been adapting their framework, which is around kind of innovation, often kind of at a national level, to a social model at a local level. So we developed these sort of principles about how missions and challenge approaches would be taken forward in Camden. So it's a sort of an extension or an evolution of the IIPP's framework. And I think probably the most important things for me within this are the need to take a bespoke approach to each mission. So real kind of need to think about kind of governance and activity related very specifically to a particular mission. There's no sort of cookie cutter approach. Each one is different. And then the other one that feels really important to me is around stewardship. So I talked before about the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration. Someone needs to hold these missions. Someone needs to ultimately be responsible for them, and that always feels like it's the entity which is democratically elected and has sort of strategic leadership for place. But that holding needs to be done in a particular way. It needs to be kind of done in a way which doesn't stifle ownership from others. So we've described that as stewarding. And then I'll talk a little bit now about some of the kind of levers, policy instruments that we are developing to help us deliver missions. So we recognise that we don't have the range of policy tools that we need to deliver on missions and challenges. So we need to develop new ones or extend existing ones. So once the Commission finished, we began to think about those in earnest, working quite closely with the IIPP again. And there's two that I point to. One is around a community wealth fund. So essentially this is a financial instrument which would be kind of new to Camden, new to UK local government. And it would be a fund capitalised by the council, but which supports co-investment from partners, both in the private and public sector. And what it aims to do is shape a fairer and more inclusive economy at a local level. And it does that by creating a fund which has significant scale, is renewed. So its portfolio of investment allows it to kind of grow over time. And it gives a kind of credible vehicle for private and public sector organisations to invest, at a scale, in a way which provides them with a return. So clearly something which is about kind of social investment in ESG, but also something which credibly stands up to organisational financial tests about where to put their money. And it will do different things to the current financial system. So its initial focus will be on supporting Black, Asian and minority ethnic founders. So to support with kind of capital and business support, which doesn't ordinarily make its way to those communities, which feels like a kind of fundamental kind of gap in our ecosystem. And the second is around procurement. So I'm sure something that the colleagues in the room are working on as well. Camden spends a very significant amount of money every year on contracts, has some forms of kind of conditionality embedded into the way that we spend our money. But we're doing a piece of work with the IIPP's design studio, which explores how we can be more expansive on that, how we can use our procurement power to support the missions that I've just described, and to think through the types of capability that we need to do that. So procurement in the UK is quite regulated activity. It's also an activity which has a set of professional assumptions and professional pathways which are about reducing risk, getting the most value for money, but with quite a narrow definition of value. So a deep piece of work to look at some of those assumptions and some of those kind of professional capabilities and sort of reimagine what that might look like. A couple of reflections before I'll pause for breath. And I'll start at the end actually, rather than at the beginning, but is to say that we are only at the end of the beginning. We've gone through this process of setting our missions, but how you deliver them, how you understand your impact and trajectory towards them is really challenging work. How you govern those missions, set up processes which aren't overly bureaucratic, which create room for creativity, which create ownership is really challenging. So I wouldn't claim that we were experts. I think we've got some interesting questions almost to pose to people who are interested in going on the same journey. The other quick things I'd say is about organisational reform. So one of the things that's been phenomenally interesting about the mission-orientated approach is the way that it's enabled us to think about how we lead in a distributed way, both across the organisation and with our partners. So I always think of it as a mechanism for changing the council as much as anything. And one of the ways that it does do that is through concentrating attention. I think that's probably one of the most fundamental things about working in broad, deep organisations that operate at a local level, is how do you get them to concentrate when there's so much to do. And the way that we've described this is that by narrowing our focus onto a smaller number of things, it creates a positive sum game where there is all sorts of learning for all of the other things that we do. It's actually when you retain that breadth and don't concentrate on what you're learning that you can feel like you're a bit all over the place. So we see it as a way of kind of learning and then applying those lessons to what we do across the rest of the organisation. I'm going to stop there. We suggested we might split this in two. So if that feels right, I'm going to pause for breath slightly and a sip of my tea, and then maybe if there's a little bit of time for questions, and then I'll be guided by people in the room about when to kick off again, so we can get through the rest of the content. Is that all right? So the next theme is sort of an extension of the previous one, really, which is about the type of organisation that you need to be to deliver on your purpose, to respond in an agile way to complex change. So I guess what Camden has done over the last 3 or 4 years is invest in a different type of capacity and capability. So a lot of it is been framed around design-led change, which we think of as being a way of thinking which requires you to kind of open up, improves what you do with kind of iteration, but can also feel quite disorientating and beyond kind of conventional control. On the flip side of that is operational certainty, the sort of stability that the bureaucracies often seek, which require consensus, routine, certainty, which absolutely have their place given the type of things that we do, which need to be safe activity, but sometimes leave less room for creativity and for new interpretations. So what we're kind of consciously trying to do is develop frameworks and capability which enable us to operate in that sweet spot in the middle. So being able to expand the boundaries of the council's comfort zone. And that's not just like a story, a narrative. It requires you to build different types of teams, different types of disciplines. It requires you to invest in your organisation in a different way. And that's what Camden has done over the last few years. And that's a lot of what my role is about. Design capacity has been quite fundamental to that. So we talk about kind of pillars of our approach rooted in strategic design. So policy design, service design, organizational design, a digital product and services capacity, and participatory capacity, which enables us to kind of listen and interact with our communities in different ways. A lot of that draws sort of inspiration from the sort of digital movement in the UK. So people might be familiar with UK's government digital service, which at least at one point was a real exemplar of digital and design-led change in government. And a lot of what we're doing is trying to kind of consciously adapt that model so that it works at a local level, and that it's kind of really closely linked to our kind of corporate strategy. And so what we mean by design, because that can be quite a kind of contested space, in some ways we think of it quite simply. So it being about people and their lived experience, so properly understanding people within their context and working with them to develop solutions. something that is quite kind of accessible and democratic and integrative. So it helps colleagues on the front line to understand the systems that they're working in. And then I think fundamentally, it tests and learns and makes things. So it's not about thinking or strategizing. It's about how you take ideas and engagement into actual change, prototypes for services, processes, policies, products, etc. So that's a fairly fundamental part of our journey. And I think design is probably the professional discipline which best supports organizations who want to take some of those things that I described at the beginning around kind of empathy and deep listening and sort of translate that into what we do on a day-to-day basis, how we deliver services, how we support change. You talked a little bit earlier about I guess the sort of cynicism and the kind of wider environment, which can be quite challenging about some of the things that I said. And we're kind of really alive to that. Really importantly, I think, is to think quite deeply about transparency and trust in public agencies, and in that rejection of a new public management approach and its ways of kind of managing and understanding progress, you need to put something else in place. Accountability remains fundamental, rightly so, as public agencies. That's really important. So this framework is how we're beginning to think about how we understand our performance as an organization, and it's quite balanced between, on this left-hand side, operational assurance, so some quite traditional approaches to dashboards, KPIs, processes for interrogating all of that information, but betwinned with different ways of sense making, which I think create a kind of richer and more accurate picture of how we're doing as a place. So in the middle, related to our We Make Camden themes, is a process of sort of 6 monthly insight reviews, which are structured around theories of change for each of our ambitions within our We Make Camden strategy. And really they're about designing a conversation with the organisation, bringing the front line together with senior leaders to really kind of understand what is going on, and then from that to be able to respond and to act. And then on the right hand side, there is something about how we understand the place and its progress over time. So we're developing a resident-led wellbeing index. So that is effectively citizens describing in their own voice how they want the place to be, and us finding ways of measuring that. So we trained a cohort of citizen scientists to work with us to help kind of design the conceptual framework for the Wellbeing Index, do some of the qualitative work with our community to understand that, and then be able to relate that to kind of household surveys, which give us the sort of secondary data, which enables us to populate that framework and then have conversations around it, both council and partners. So this is an attempt, I suppose, to build a model which helps you understand progress, impact in a place, but does it in a way which is uniquely Camden and uniquely about that kind of new mode of thinking, that kind of community paradigm mode of thinking. This is a little bit more on the Citizen Wellbeing Index, which I won't spend too long on, but just to say that, you know, it draws from existing best practice on wellbeing measurements kind of nationally, but is fundamentally kind of co-created with the communities, and we will prioritize indicators that yes, reflect outcomes and can be consistently measured and comparable with other places, but also include subjective measures based on what our communities say is important to them. Because I think what ends up happening is you come to a very different set of measures about what's important to people. which, there's huge amounts of overlap with how we measure performance kind of currently, but there are some quite significant differences as well. And then the last thing I'll talk about in this section is some of our participatory practice. So certainly in a UK context, we lead in this field. So our first citizen assembly was actually in 2017, when Georgia first came into the council and set our kind of long-term strategy. So worked with 70 citizens over a month to think about direction of the borough to 2025. The example that you see on the screen is around our climate crisis work. So it took a very similar approach, but to a particular kind of challenge. And we found citizens' assemblies incredibly useful for working with citizens to set agendas and to do that in a way which kind of influences systems partners and brings them together around a really clear vision and set of expectations for how we will work and how we will support our communities. So we've done a number of these around climate crisis, but also around health and well-being. So a really important kind of mechanism. But what we're kind of interested in is how you go that next stage further and begin to integrate that participative practice into everything that the council does. To some extent, this is still a tool for setting agendas, for providing a kind of direction to activity. But the way that we make decisions about public money and the kind of mainstream business of the council is still quite kind of traditional approach. The last section, as I said at the beginning, I sort of offer up by way of kind of inspiration, really. So this is very new. We're really only kind of a couple of weeks into a program of work, which I'll kind of describe before I stop. But it hangs off, I suppose, many of the kind of themes of what I've said so far. And I suppose the basic hypothesis is this, really, that imagination is really kind of fundamental. It's a superpower. With it, all sorts of change becomes possible, but exercising that imagination is not always easy, and you need kind of frameworks and mechanisms to support you to exercise that imaginative muscle. That there's a kind of wider field around social and collective imagination which is emerging, and I'm sure you've kind of come across it, but feels kind of really compelling to me because it's about creating plausible alternative visions of the world, and sort of recognizes that if we don't do that, if we're not capable of that imaginative exercise, then we are kind of paralyzed by the crises, and there is very little hope, and without hope things can atrophy. So the work that we're doing in Camden is to try and build some of that scaffolding and support, and where we started is within our organisation. We also think that Camden is an imaginative place already, and that's a lot of why this work kind of resonates with us. And we started to think about the ecology, the kind of landscape of imagination in Camden, which is made up of really four things, we think. So one is around kind of narratives and stories. So I talked about We Make Camden, the way we work. Those feel really kind of fundamental because they provide the anchor. Leaders and activists, so people like Georgia and Jenny, some of the relational activists that I talked about in our children's social work, and then infrastructure, which is kind of an ugly word in some ways, but actually that participative practice, our voluntary charity sector, our schools and their kind of focus on a culture of voice and activism, all of these things are sort of the bits in between and below which support imagination to happen. And then the other thing is around experimentation. So I talked a little bit before about that third horizon. I think experiments which point the way to the future, which are acts of imagination in themselves, kind of really fundamental, that kind of inspiration, though difficult to fund, difficult to do in a kind of culture of cynicism and the culture of now, are kind of really kind of important. So we have a set of hypotheses. I won't go through these about why imagination is important. I'll pick out a couple which feel most interesting. So the first is around it, as I said, it being a necessary condition for positive change. And secondly, that it's instrumental, that those imaginative acts, the imaginative muscle, practically leads into different ways of thinking about how you care in your community, how you make the transition to net zero. And then again, the capability and capacity that you need to move from those visions into experimentation and delivery. So some of the themes that I've talked about so far. So what are we actually doing? So this is the really exciting bit. So we're training about 33 imagination activists, we're calling them, across Camden through an 8-week program. So those will be colleagues from a range of different parts of the organisation, from kind of administrators to people who work in housing, people who work in libraries, children's social work. So people from the front line, people at management level as well. And they will have an opportunity to learn the new tools and techniques for their own development, and also ultimately help to spread imagination across our organisation. So to the point that was made earlier about the sustainability of that leadership, I think this is an attempt to support that leadership to grow and broaden across the organisation. So it feels quite exciting. It feels quite fundamental in that it's about shifting kind of mindsets in an organisation. And what we hope will come out of it is like a cohort of imagination activists. So those people who on the programme like coalesce as a kind of community and form a community of practice in Camden, which ultimately could be joined by residents. They're supported with kind of small pots of money to help them do activity, which can do that kind of embedding, and have lots of kind of support from kind of leadership and management to do that. And then increasingly become involved in some of our participatory activity with citizens, because the ultimate goal, I suppose, is to connect this up with what is happening in our communities. We started with our staff because in many ways there is a huge imaginative capacity in our communities already. The problem is when that capacity buffs up against a bureaucracy which is sometimes slow, sometimes a bit staid, quite risk averse. So if we can flip that mindset within our organisation, then the kind of energy that we can release across our communities could be quite fundamental. Well, then just with a few quotes really, which I think are really kind of illustrative of the impact that the programme could have. So this person's talked about feeling less scared, able to think and act more, and to like themselves regardless of how that comes across. So there is something about the psychological safety that this approach promotes in people, about feeling able to speak up about more things that I feel are important. So trusting kind of instinct and feeling kind of safe to do that. And finally, kind of like different ways of thinking. So people thinking about emotion, the heart as well as the mind, and building a confidence that things like intuition, things like kind of felt sense, a different way of thinking at work is not only kind of possible but legitimate and can have real kind of power to it. I'm going to stop there. This last bit just is a series of links to some of the things that I've said. So one of the things that we've started to try and do in Camden is to write some of this down, I guess, as a way of helping like refine our thinking. Talking about it in public is is hard, but also it does help you better clarify how you think, and most importantly to invite collaboration with others. If we write it down, people might read it, we might get into conversations like this with colleagues like you, and then we can build a kind of community of interest of people who are passionate about this type of work and are thinking about the really challenging bits within it, because it is kind of challenging work, so it does need a bit of kind of companionship in it. But we'll share this afterwards, and love to know what people think. But I'm going to stop.